Hello and welcome to U.S. News and World Report. I'm Simon Owens, and here with me is Brad Ricka, author of the new book Superboys: The Amazing Adventures of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the creators of Superman. Welcome.
Hey Simon, thanks for having me.
So Brad, now when people think of Superman, they think of Metropolis and the Daily Planet and New York City, but Superman didn't have its roots in New York, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't know that those early issues actually take place in Cleveland. They're not really overt about it, but there's a couple scenes where, like Clark's, trying to get a telegram off to his editor, and he says, send it to Cleveland, which is really weird, because people always associate Superman with Metropolis. And sure enough, once the comic took off, got more popular, it mysteriously moved to this fictional, version of New York that was Metropolis. But in the beginning, it was Cleveland and a lot of kind of street level crime with gambling and mobsters and that kind of stuff.
So introduce us to these two characters. Jerry was the writer and Joe was the artist, right?
Yeah, and they were, they were kind of the stereotypical high school best friends, both kind of from poor households. Jerry was the kid who really wanted to be a writer. He would read all these pulp magazines and short stories and just really wanted to write stuff because he thought, then he'd be famous and then girls would like him and life would be complete.
And I noticed that your book was very much written in that genre of a very kind of pulp-like approach to the biography.
Yeah, I tried to, because that's what they read, and it seems like the story has that kind of mythic register that I thought it would be, kind of add another layer to it to kind of get into that kind of pulp prose, that's really kind of pushes things towards cliffhangers and keeps readers on their toes a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And I was struck how much Superman is kind of the embodiment of all the weaknesses of its creators. He was super strength, while Joe Shuster was sensitive about how small and scrawny he was, and he has supervision, whereas Shuster had thick glasses and could barely see.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. We tend to dismiss Superman as this kind of, silly character. I mean, he was the first one, but you look at there's all these autobiographical elements to the character. Just like you said, Joe was really small and he, drank all these raw eggs and worked out, and he had these really thick glasses. I mean, that makes, perfect sense when you look at the character.
And Schuster I think he eventually almost went blind, pretty much, right?
Yeah, I mean, he had some sort of, ailment from birth, really. And there's all these stories of, he would draw these characters, really close to the table, with his eyes almost an inch away from the table. But it just, goes to show how much, just like Jerry wanted to be a writer, Joe really wanted to be an artist. And he had, very little training, so just kept, tracing things and learning things on his own, to get better, and always fighting against his eyesight.
And how did Clark Kent represent them in a lot of ways? I mean, he's a nerd who's constantly being rejected by Lois Lane, and we know, and can you talk a little bit about the high school newspaper that Jerry was constantly trying to get girls to notice him?
Yeah, so they had this great high school newspaper. So, back then, I mean, high school was sort of like the small college, right? Because a lot of people weren't going on to higher education. So they had this great newspaper, and Jerry got on it, and, he kind of used it, he wasn't very good around, the girls in school, so he kind of used it to try and talk to these, more popular girls. And this story is as old as time almost. So he starts putting in these weird poems and stories, and he uses these kind of alias names that if you read the paper you can figure it out, but they still get him nowhere, so he's just kind of using a different identity to try and express himself, and that kind of seems to me, where Clark Kent comes from, which is really kind of, the genius of the whole character.
And how does Superman kind of represent the immigrant mindset? Like in a way, he was an immigrant, in the being sent to Earth from Krypton, and the creators were sons of immigrant parents, right?
Yeah, both their sets of parents, and I go into this in the book, flee from kind of very different but very similar, really escalating situations in Europe. Lots of violence and really just trying to get out of there with their lives, and that's Krypton, right? Krypton is exploding, and let's get over here. But then when they get here, I think Jerry and Joe go through what a lot of kind of first generation Americans, and especially first generation Jewish Americans too, that their parents are kind of weird. They speak this different language, so they're identifying with being American, but they're also kind of dealing with this kind of ethnic past that's really overwhelming at home, and they're trying to reconcile that.
And what other parallels do we see between the Superman comic books and what was going on at the time in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, it's really one of the strangest things I found was reading all these newspapers from the 30s is how similar it was to today. Nobody had jobs. Everyone's worried about foreign wars. How much we would be involved, what that would cost. Kind of rogue nations, but just at home, so much crime. I live here in Cleveland, and there's just every day there's another kind of heartbreaking story, and going through all these papers in the 30s, it's the same thing. It's almost kind of overwhelming to kind of see the city like this, but at the same time, there's growth. Like Cleveland, they just built their one skyscraper, and it was really cool. So even though things were not so good on the ground, people could look at this kind of gleaming vision of the future and kind of realize that there was hope.
Yeah, I remember there was one part where Superman actually tries to tackle automotive accidents, which kind of reflected at the time the record number of people who were dying in cars.
Yeah, you read all these early Superman comics where he's going to stand up for auto safety, and that seemed really weird. And then I go and look in the papers, and that's all anybody was talking about. And there's even an account that Jerry Siegel himself was playing in the street and was sort of sideswiped by a car. The people were really, really. I mean, I don't mean to make light of it. It's a big problem. There was a lot of deaths because of it. So of course they make Superman, and that's one thing he's going to tackle.
And how did Superman and other comic books change as the world changed, as we moved from fear of Nazis to fear of communists to fear of terrorists?
Yeah, I mean, it's always kind of there. I mean, Superman's kind of a little different. Once we go into World War II, they kind of realized the character wouldn't really work there because he'd win the war in 10 minutes, and they do this really strange, kind of couple-page cartoon where he does win it in 10 minutes. So they kind of just put him on the cover with a bunch of GIs, but he doesn't really do it. But yeah, as the times change, the character definitely changes. Villains become, they begin kind of scientific, then they become political, then they become extraterrestrial, then they become, back kind of political. At one point they just get weird. It's all about Lois, trying to uncover, his secret identity, and they're just really bizarre. But yeah, they definitely changed with the times. I mean, even now, so there's all these kind of terrorism stories. They're metaphors. They're aliens or invaders from another dimension, but they're meant to kind of parallel what's going on in the real world.
Well, one of the interesting parts of your book is how they decided that Superman had to have a weakness after a bombing that occurred at the World's Fair. Why was that the pivotal point when kryptonite was invented?
Yeah, because Superman was really invulnerable. I mean, his only kind of vulnerability was Lois Lane, that she liked Superman but hated Clark. I mean, that kind of hurt. But the character itself could do anything, and there's this, they have this big day for the character at the New York World's Fair where it's the first time that somebody, puts on a Superman costume and says, I'm Superman, you want my autograph? This happens all the time now, but back then it was, it's a big deal for a fictional character. And the day after that, there's this terrorism bombing at the fair, and it kind of, builds on all these things that were happening in the world, and the war coming, and even Jerry Siegel realizing that the character was kind of being taken away from him a little bit. So I think that was part of him, wanting to design a flaw for the character, which was, this really bizarre story called the K-Metal story, where it's kind of the precursor to kryptonite. and it was written, it was drawn up, and it never ran because the company, who would become DC Comics, says, we don't want a weakness. Also in the story, Lois discovers the Superman and Clark are the same thing. So it didn't run, but then, very coincidentally, not too much longer after, Kryptonite shows up on the radio show, and that's how the weakness starts.
Mm-hmm. And that was a way for people to relate to them because everybody was feeling scared at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And it had all these radiation fears, too. Yeah.
Well, Brad, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate talking to you.
Oh, thanks. It was great.